In this scene, we'll be introduced to the ExplosiaFX solver. We'll go through the basic setup of adding an ExplosiaFX object and creating a source. We'll discover that ExplosiaFX is a voxel-based solver containing separate channels, properties, and advection modes. Lastly, we'll modify the container bounds and see how the adaptive bound tracks our simulation. Okay, so here we are in Cinema 4D. And we're going to start with a really basic scene, a really basic ExplosiaFX setup to help us get a better understanding of the ExplosiaFX solver. So first thing, of course, we're going to need to add is the ExplosiaFX object. Xparticles menu at the top here, Dynamics, XP ExplosiaFX. And you'll see in our viewport we have these bounds being added. Then we're going to need a piece of geometry or a source for our ExplosiaFX simulation. Just going to add a simple piece of geometry. Let's use a primitive. Let's use a torus. Let's shrink it down, put it towards the bottom of the container, making sure it's still within the bounds you can see there. And then we're going to have to tell the ExplosiaFX object that this piece of geometry, this torus, is a source. So we do that by adding a tag. So we right click the torus, Xparticles tags, and then you'll see the XP ExplosiaFX source tag. So we drop that on there like so. And now that's going to be communicating to the ExplosiaFX object that this is a source. We can hit play and you'll see now properties are being added to our simulation. We can see some fuel, we can see some smoke. They're advecting, they're moving through the volume, the container, and we're getting this nice fluid simulation. But what's actually going on under the hood? What are we actually seeing here? Well, if we go back to our ExplosiaFX object, we can go to the solver tab and we'll see our first parameter is voxel size. And there's a clue to the fact that our ExplosiaFX volume here is divided up into smaller parts called voxels. So it's essentially a three-dimensional grid, a volumetric grid. And we can actually view that if we go to the display tab. And we're currently displaying the grid, just the bounds. So that's the outer bounds. And we can click on voxels to view all of the voxels. So we now have a display that's showing us every single voxel within our bound. And if I move up to the corner here, you'll see there's a little clearer. So we have a voxel every 4 units and it's filling our domain. It's dividing up our ExplosiaFX volume. Now there's a slightly clearer way to view that, and so we can see our fluid as well. And that is using either just the back, where it just shows us the division size, the voxel size, on the back face or on the base. Now, if I hit play and add some fluid to our simulation, add some properties to our voxels, you'll see, there we go. Now I can actually uncheck this box here called interpolate, which is a smoothing algorithm to allow us to view nice smooth fluids. And you'll see very clearly our voxels. So each one of these sort of cubes it's filled with either currently smoke or fuel. You'll see the display is set to fuel or smoke. And very clearly we can see those are just smaller boxes within the larger bound. So I'm going to turn interpolate back on because it looks nicer. Go back to our solver tab. And now the next thing to understand is that our voxels carry data. They carry properties. And the main properties that we have going on at the moment, if we go to our channels drop down here, you'll see we have smoke, heat, and fuel. And this is what our ExplosiaFX object is currently solving. It's solving a lot of other stuff, but these are the main 3 channels we have active at the moment. You can see we have smoke. If I turn that off, the solver no longer bothers with smoke at all, and none of the voxels are carrying the smoke property. They're still carrying fuel and heat. And if I turn the smoke back on, it is now solving and adding smoke back into our voxels. Okay, so if we go to our source tag, we'll see this even more clearly. And you'll see we have these properties, and the smoke, heat, and fuel, as we've just seen, are the main ones we're going to be looking at. But we also have curl, we have velocity, and we have pressure and color. And essentially, what's happening is within our torus, we've told the ExplosiaFX object that within our torus, any voxels within it, we need to add 100% heat and 100% fuel. And then from that point, through the solver, through the ExplosiaFX solver, we then end up with advection, which is the transport of those properties into a different place, moving them, resulting velocities, moving them through our simulation. So just to demonstrate that, we actually have heat and fuel being emitted, and we're still seeing smoke. Well, the reason we're seeing smoke, even though we have 0% here in the tag, is that this is actually combusting. We have enough heat to ignite this fuel and generate smoke from that process. So I'm just going to turn fuel off completely, and you'll see that our smoke is still rising. We still have temperature, and you can see our adaptive bounds is still solving within there. But we actually have no smoke anymore. We have no fuel. So we're displaying smoke and fuel. So I'm just going to increase smoke gently, and you can see we're adding only 6% inside of the voxels within our torus. So we get a much less dense smoke solve. And then we can increase that all the way, and you'll see it becomes denser and denser until we're adding a full 100%. And you can actually no longer add any more to that specific voxel. It cannot take any more smoke. It's at its full saturation. However, we can actually overdrive the tag. So if I set it to 500%, you'll see it actually looks like it's getting thicker. Well, actually what's really happening is the voxel is filling with smoke faster. So with all the effects diffusing it out, moving it around, we're actually simply replacing that advected smoke much quicker. And since we're at this full saturation, if we do want to add more smoke to our sim and more smoke to our voxels, we'll actually need to either move our source object, so we slightly move it around so it's occupying more voxels at any one time. And then also we could use other velocities, other inputs, and a good one to use is pressure, because there's a relationship there. If you've got a higher density in real life, you're going to get a bit more smoke. And in fact, if I go back to that 500%, and I increase our pressure as well, you'll see we get a much thicker smoke, but also a more voluminous smoke as well. So the voxels are at 100%, there's a higher pressure now, and it's pushing them all out, and we're getting a much smokier simulation. Now let's reset our ExplosiaFX source tag, go back to our ExplosiaFX object, and we're going to take a look quickly at the advection settings. So advection is, as I said before, it's the transport of these properties from one place to another. So in our case, it's through the voxels. It's passing data, properties from one voxel to the next. And how that's calculated, how that's solved, we actually have a few different controls. And the reason for this is that there's efficiencies in keeping some of the channels simple and some of the channels more advanced and intelligent. And we'll take a look. We've got 6 channels here. We've got 6 properties: smoke, heat, fuel, velocity, UVW, and color advection. And each of them has an identical type of drop down with 3 options. We have smart, linear, and advanced. So smart advection is the heaviest. It's the most memory intensive, but it's the most accurate. It's going to give you the most detail. So we keep that for smoke because very often we are viewing the smoke. We are seeing smoke, and we want to maintain as much detail as possible in that smoke. This is especially important when you have high vorticities and things like that. Now, linear, so I've got smart set for smoke. If I change it to linear, we'll actually lose quite a bit of the detail, but it will be faster to calculate. It's a much simpler thing, and you'll see we get a more diffuse smoke simulation. And then if we also take a look at advanced, this is similar to smart. It's in between smart and linear. It will maintain more details, but it's not as intensive as smart. Now, that's a good one to use for fuel. If I just reset those, you'll see fuel has been set to advanced. Heat is linear, color is linear, and UVW is linear. Now, these channels don't need to be particularly detailed. They are passing properties into the simulation that are not visualized. We don't see those very often. So if I go to the display tab, we go to temperature, you'll see it's much more diffuse and smooth. But remember, it's only passing this temperature property into the next channel or into the next one to allow it to feed the burning model, for instance, which will then generate more smoke, or it might generate more expansion, that kind of thing. So the advections, we have control over them. Generally, these are all left. You leave them at default. If you're finding you need more detail in one of the channels, you can set them to smart. If you only need them to be really diffuse, set them to linear, and your calculations will be faster. Okay, let's go back to the display mode with fuel and smoke. Now the next option we're going to take a look at is the container bounds. And obviously we have our container, we can control the size. So this is the envelope in which the simulation occurs. Currently it's all at the default, and we can move the container as a whole to different places, but the container options here allow us to close the bounds. So if I start a simulation, let's reset our tag again, hit play, and you'll see our simulation occurring. And as I move it to the top of the container, at the top, it just moves out of the container. It clips out of the container. There's no collision at all. And what these options allow us to do is they allow us to simulate a collision with the container interior. So as you can see, it's flooding our container. And as I add more of I close off more of the walls, you'll see it starts to actually fill the container. So that's a pretty cool effect. Like so. So that's a handy option if you need to close the bounds. Often you'll only have one of them, so it'll often be just the floor or just the ceiling of the container. And then next up we have adaptive bounds. Now this is really important. So if I move our object back to the middle here and we start playing, you'll see there's this blue bounds around our simulation and it tracks with the simulation. So as I move it across here, it expands out. And essentially what this is to keep the simulation as efficient as possible. So what is occurring is the simulation is only occurring, the processing is only occurring within this bounds, this adaptive bounds, which of course saves on memory, saves on processing power, all sorts of good stuff like that. And the way it does this is it's looking for information inside the voxels, then it looks within a certain amount of range, it looks for an amount inside a voxel. And if there's enough of that amount inside a voxel, if enough of that property, based on these thresholds over here, it will actually push the bounds out. It will expand those bounds in preparation for more stuff to move into those, more properties to move into those voxels. Okay, so let's just show what this actually means when I start turning things off. So if I turn track, heat and smoke off, you'll see that our bounds is adapting, but it's only adapting to the fuel. So you'll see we actually start to get clipping. Where there's no fuel, the smoke actually gets clipped. You'll see, like so. And if I turn the smoke back on, it's back to tracking and the bounds are actually larger. So we need to use this, especially if you're using really fast simulations, really fast expanding things. Sometimes you'll need to change the thresholds to adapt and allow the bounds to adapt. Now I can turn them off completely, like so. And this will simply mean that our entire volume, our entire container is now being simulated. So velocities are being calculated all the way over here, but obviously that's really unnecessary and inefficient, and you'll see it's much slower. So recommended to leave adaptive bounds on. The adaptive size is a padding value, so essentially around each voxel. This is you rarely need to change this one, but sometimes you'll need to expand it or reduce it to get it to react to your simulation and keep it as efficient as possible. Okay, and then the last one in our solver, the last one in our ExplosiaFX solver is that we can set an initial state for our simulation. So if let's take our sim here and say I'm moving it around and I filled the volume and I want to start from this state here. It's just the same as an emitter, just the same as particles. You set the state, go back to 0, and we'll play and you'll see it starts with the volume there. So that's very handy if you're starting with an already ignited fire, an explosion somewhere through, and you don't have to simulate all the frames up to that point again.